with Renee.
Yo. We wait all week and all day for more Saturdays with Renee.
Welcome, everybody, to this special edition of Saturdays with Renee on Memorial Day, featuring Renee Johnston, and I hope our future governor of Maryland, Andy Ellis of the Green Party. I'm Jared Ball. Please like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, support the platform, blackliberationmedia.org. My bad, y'all. I'm struggling with the whole everything is in full collapse on my end technologically. So anyway, welcome everybody.
You can't be having no technical lapses because I don't know nothing about pushing no buttons. I was on here like, what do I do? Do I push to go live? What do I do?
And I know what buttons to push on mine, but I'm not telling you what to push on Jared's, But thank you all. I'm excited to be here on this Memorial Day. It's 12:05. Who cares? All right. I think it's 12:05 on a Monday. Let's do it.
That's what I'm talking about. Aside from the tech collapse, Jared, how's life?
As good as could be expected. Everything was great until like 10 minutes ago. So had a great discussion, obviously, with Dr. Akinyele Umoja this morning. So people should definitely check that out. And everything was great until like 10 minutes ago. But other than that, please, everybody go to the store and get you this new merch. Get the support, get you some summer wears, and I'm sure you'll end up feeling better as I will in a few minutes. How are you doing?
Man, I'm back to being as well as capitalism allows. That's it. That's all I got. That's where I'm at. How about you, Andy? I saw you had a busy weekend running for governor.
I had a busy weekend, and I was really, when I heard the song that it was Saturdays, for a brief moment, I thought it was, and I was really excited about that. But, whatever, it's Monday, busy weekend, doing good stuff, talking to people, all that type of thing. And then, it's Monday, it's Memorial Day. Summer starts today, so I'm good.
There we go. So this is just so everyone knows, this is how this all went down. So I get a random text from Jared on like a Saturday afternoon that says, I'm at lunch with Andy, and can we get Andy on to talk about this reparations bill and what's happening in Maryland? And so, because Jared never looks at the run sheet until we're like about to go live on something, he doesn't have the schedule to know that we are literally booked out until like late June, which is also a little crazy that we've like gotten to this place where I actually have to keep a schedule for like who's coming on when, so we don't lose track of folks. But as we were talking and going back and forth, and then I reached out to Andy, and Andy and I were going back and forth, I felt like the conversation was worth doing an off Saturday show, because I didn't want to wait on the conversation, one, because we'd be talking about this in late June, and who knows what other shenanigans will happen between now and then. But also because I feel like Memorial Day is a good day to pick on the US government and to expose all of the shenanigans for what they are. And so I said to Jared, how about we just do it off Monday? Andy was free. And so here we are with one of our returning guests, one of the faves, Andy Ellis. And so we're going to talk a little policy, talk a little duopoly bullshitting people, talk about what's going on in Maryland. Maybe we'll kick in some of this IHRA bill that's happening in New Jersey and talk about how that works. I don't know if Geechee remembered that he was supposed to be on. I'll send him a text because it just occurred to me that he's not here. And then we can just get going. So I don't know where we want to start, Jared. If you had a particular place, or Andy, if you had a particular.
Well, I know
place.
I did, because when we met the other day, Andy had already predicted what was going to happen, and Wes Moore, our governor, our current governor of Maryland, and I think important to note, Black governor of Maryland, has vetoed a reparations bill that would have been, much like the national ones, a bill to study reparations and the need for, and just, the details of reparations and here in Maryland. But he vetoed it. And I've seen some of his defenders saying that he vetoed it as a mechanism to focus on actual reparations as opposed to just a study. He's even being praised in some circles for having done this and resisted the temptation. But as you put to me, and I think it's more important to frame it this way, that this is another sign that whether it's reparations or any other form, reparative justice or progressive politics and policy, we can't expect to get it from this two-party system, that neither party is interested in doing it. And Maryland, as any, would be as well suited as any to be a test case, given all the Democratic Party power in this state. So yeah, that's where I would like to start. And I thought, Andy, you were all over this story, and maybe could tell us more about it and bring some details.
Yeah, sure. So, what I didn't know that day, I was sure that he was going to veto it. What I wasn't sure was, like, on our way home from like lunch with you, I would get the note that he had vetoed it that Friday. So,
Right, that day, right, yeah.
I thought he was going to wait till the end. But so SB 587 was a bill this year that went through the Maryland Senate and the Maryland House. It would have set up a commission that studied reparations for 2 years. For the most part, it wasn't studying whether they were due, but it was studying ways to pay different forms of reparation in the state of Maryland. And so oftentimes when we have these study bills, if they're asking the question, are they due? I think that question, has probably been relatively well studied. But at the state level of policy in a place like Maryland, what to do is not so easily figured out. It takes some work in order to look at the different policies and to look at the laws of Maryland and figure out what they would do. So this would have been a study bill. It would have done that, and it would have given initial recommendations to the next governor in January of 2027. So whoever wins, if I'm the next governor, those recommendations will be on my desk when I get inaugurated. If Wes Moore wins, those recommendations will be on his desk. And then it would have required final recommendations by November of 2027, which would have set up the 2028 legislative session as the place where reparations legislation got introduced. And it's interesting to think about what's happening in the winter of 2028. That's when the Democratic primaries are going to be happening to figure out who's going to be able to take on Trump and who's going to, or JD Vance, whichever one happens, right? So the timing of this is really interesting. So Black Caucus of Maryland, largest Black caucus in the country, I think 64 members, 1/3 of the entire General Assembly, sponsors this bill. It's a major legislative priority. It passes the Senate of Maryland with every Democrat voting for it. It passes the House of Maryland with every Democrat voting for it. So pretty good as study bills go, pretty specific about what it was requiring to be studied, pretty specific about what it was requiring to be recommended. And, I thought they crafted a pretty decent bill. And I was looking forward to having a debate with either Wes Moore or whoever, with whoever it was about this policy when it hits their desk. So, as I mentioned to you, Jared, I was pretty certain he was going to veto it. And I have been pretty certain he was going to veto it since it passed. And I've been talking to some other folks. And I think, for those of us outside of the Democratic Party, it almost feels a little bit obvious that he would have vetoed it. But I think there are a lot of people inside the Democratic Party and inside the Black Caucus who were really shocked and surprised that the first Black governor of Maryland and the only Black governor in the country, in a Democrat supermajority state where Democrats have a decades-long gerrymandered veto-proof majority. I think there are a lot of people who were surprised about it. Like I said, I wasn't surprised about it, and I think it's a really good opportunity to expose the way that two-party politics work. I think it played out exactly as I thought it would. So while he was not talking about it and all of that, we put together our reparations plan, which we think addresses the reparative justice that is necessary in Maryland, and we had it ready to go as soon as he vetoed it, so folks would understand what a different framework of politics looked like on this. So that's sort of the details of what the bill was and what happened. Do you want to talk about the his reasons for vetoing?
Yeah, I do, because in part, I wanted to specifically have you follow up on if you can, some details that I don't have, which are the ways he is claiming to actually do reparations. What is he saying? Particularly Black residents of Baltimore, of Maryland, could expect through or should be looking for in terms of what he's been able to do or wanting to do
Yeah.
instead of this. Yeah.
So he vetoes this bill, and I think a lot of people, even the people who knew he was going to veto it, didn't really predict exactly why he was going to veto it until about a week out, when there started to be some permission structures being set up and local op-eds and things like that for him to use this "we've already studied it enough" type of argument. And so what he says, we've already done enough studies. We don't need to study anymore. We don't need another commission. He sort of co-opts this more radical critique of of reparations commissions and things like that. And he says he's already doing the work, and he's already doing the work by things like supporting minority businesses, by poverty reduction, by Black homeownership, by Black entrepreneurship. And I think he has largely sort of worked to apply democratic policy, poverty reduction and affirmative action programs as his framework. And then he says, Juneteenth, he's going to have a big announcement about how he's going to try to close the wealth gap in Maryland, increase Black home ownership, and increase Black entrepreneurship. So, he's sort of relying on his existing record of this and saying we're going to announce more of it as stuff that we take forward to the General Assembly in 2026. So we'll see. We'll see what he comes forward with. But I mean, for the most part, it is sort of Democratic Party affirmative action / poverty reduction type of programs that are what he has banked on and what he has made his claim to be closing the racial wealth gap and to be creating opportunity and things like that. He talks about, people of color entrepreneurs. He talks about Black home ownership. He talks about, trying to reduce childhood poverty and these type of things, And so what I think he's trying to do, I mean, what I would have appreciated if he had done actually is said, look, I don't believe in a reparative justice framework. I'm a Democrat, and Democrats have a long tradition of these poverty reduction and affirmative action programs as their means of addressing this problem. And we think the more radical approach of reparative justice is a bad one, right? I would have respected if he had said that. But I think he's trying to do this thing. And, if Democrats are doing anything at any point, it's co-opting radical arguments and using them to sell liberal policy. And so he's co-opting this pretty radical, oftentimes, I guess, I'll put radical in quotes for a second. We haven't done enough we've done enough studies argument, and using it to justify Black entrepreneurship, home ownership, and those type of things. And fine, those policies, I don't have a problem if the government wants to do those policies. I don't want to have a problem if it wants to refine procurement to have more Black businesses get government contracts. All of those things are fine, but I don't think they're a reparative justice framework. I think they're a affirmative action and poverty reduction framework.
Can I just say
Absolutely.
the framing of co-opting radical politics for liberal policy making needs to be like on a poster
Yeah,
somewhere.
I
Like,
mean,
like for real. Like,
Now listen.
because it's
you're
really like that is the simplest way to explain what they do. It really
yeah.
is.
That is like one of the Democratic Party's best messaging points, or most effective. We won't call it best. Most effective messaging points is co-opting radical language and radical rhetoric in order to justify liberal policy. That's what they do. That's Hillary Clinton was a master of it. She was excellent at doing that, and they, took a lot of identity politics slogans and ideas, strip them of their materiality, use them to justify liberal policy, and then claim that they're supporters of the radical policy when they're only supporters of the radical rhetoric.
That's facts. So, I mean, since we have you here, do you want to talk about the platform that you released a little bit so that people can understand the differential between what you all want to do and what the Democrats are putting forward?
Sure, and we'll see. Like, look, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's see what he comes out with on Juneteenth. He's going to the Eastern Shore. He's going to give a big speech. So let's see what he comes out with. If he comes out with something that is reparative and truly different from what he's done before, I'll be the first to say, good job, he did that. But I don't think that's likely what's going to happen. And so I'll say that first, and then I'll pivot and say, here's a little bit of what we're talking about. So the first thing I think to know here is that the Green Party has had reparations in our platform for 25 years. Since people have known about the Green Party in the United States, reparations have been in the platform. And so we have thought about this a lot. We've thought about it a lot. We are no longer on the question of whether they're due. We're long since onto the question of what to do. And so some of the stuff that we outline here in our policy are things like increased funding for the Community Repair and Reinvestment Funds. So in the 2023 Cannabis Reform Act directed a chunk of recreational cannabis taxation revenue toward these funds that have to get set up in each county and are locally controlled in those counties that give out, they give chunks of that money to community-based programs that are trying to repair community and civic society in Black communities, or civil society in Black communities. So LBS, I think, has probably been on before, talked a lot about that framework of reparations that they use. There's a Baltimore City Reparations Fund. There's a Montgomery County Reparations Fund. So we think this is an existing policy. We think we should give additional revenue to that policy so more money can go out of the hands of the foundations and the government and into Black communities to disperse. So that's one thing. The second thing is the way that the report about the commission is, or the way that the legislation about the commission is written, is really fascinating. So it covers two periods of time. It covers people who were enslaved in the state of Maryland. So that's the founding of the state of Maryland up until 1864, when Maryland passed its own constitutional amendment ending slavery. Then it covers the period from the end of Reconstruction through Jim Crow, and it defines that as 1877 through 1965. Well, what's fascinating about that is Maryland was a union state that had 87,000 people enslaved in 1860. And because it was a union state, it was not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation, and it was not subject to federal Reconstruction. So people who were enslaved in the state of Maryland did not get, slavery didn't end in Maryland until a constitutional amendment in 1864. By 1866, Democrats in the state of Maryland and former slaveholders in the state of Maryland had regained political power in the General Assembly, and they kind of haven't ever lost it since then. So from the period of 1866 to 1877, Maryland had Democrats, slave owners, Confederates in charge of their government, while the rest of the Deep South was going through federal imposed Reconstruction. And a lot of stuff happened during that time that was really important in shaping how Maryland ended up. So the original bill, as written, skips over that whole period of time where Maryland is doing its Reconstruction. So our platform is to also extend any work a commission does to include that period where slaveholders took power again 2 years after the constitutional amendment that tried to disempower them. The
So,
third thing,
I'm sorry, Andy. That you said that. So that's 1866 to 77. Is that what you were saying?
yep.
11
So
years.
11
So,
years. 11 years. And during that time in Maryland, there were apprenticeships programs where courts were taking freed people's children and sending them back to the plantations that they had previously worked on. There were all sorts of other places where people were not being allowed to. There's a book that almost sort of says, or that starts to argue that the birth of Jim Crow started on Maryland's Eastern Shore during that time period, because while they were free, there were no Freedmen's Bureau presence there. There was no federal presence there for the most part. And the former slaveholders in Southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore, who had controlled the government of Maryland going into the war, basically were in control of the government coming out of the war. And so that the
in
bill,
addition to everything else, the Green Party would give back our 11 years.
we'd give back that 11
Hashtag
years.
11 years. Give back
Hashtag
our 11. Bring
a
back the
hashtag like
11.
let's try, right? So I mean, Maryland's self-reconstruction happened during that time period, and it's really unique amongst states. Jersey was a border state, Delaware was a border state, Missouri, Kentucky, these other border states had their own sort of self-reconstruction, but Maryland's was probably the most acute and the most quick for folks to have that large of a population of enslaved folks that were put under the power of the people who had enslaved them within a year after the Civil War ended. So we would give that part back. Second is we would make the commission a sort of reckoning, reconstruction, and repair commission permanent, but we wouldn't make it a federal agent or a state agency. And I know some of the plans for state level reparations talk about making it a state agency, but until state government is taken out of one party control in this state, I don't think it makes sense to create a state agency where the Democratic Party would have entire control over all of that stuff. So we call for it to be made a commission that is made up of HBCUs, scholars, professors, all sorts of folks who can study this stuff with the resources that they need without being a state agency under the control of the governor's office. So I think beyond that, we would call for some form of cash payment reparations. Cash reparations at the state level are not the same thing as they are at the federal level. And I think it's really important when we talk about cash payment reparations to understand that the federal government, A, has more responsibility at the cash level, and B, more ability at the cash level. States can't print money, they can't cut the military budget, they can't do any of that type of thing that the federal government can do. Nonetheless, especially in a state like Maryland that had its own control of Reconstruction, where redlining began, all of that, there are some actuarial claims where state government directly harm people, and we should figure out what those are, get cash payment to them. I think another thing that we would talk about is cemeteries and sacred spaces. So we've been working with the Bethesda Africa Cemetery Coalition on this, and they have a reparative demand for the Moses Macedonia Cemetery in Bethesda, which was taken by the county, and we're currently like a storage facility and a county building sit on top of what was the cemetery for a free Black community in River Road and Bethesda area. They say that they want the land restored, they want the rights restored for the descendants to have control of it, and they want funding for a museum to tell the story about Black life in Montgomery County at that time. We think those type of reparative claims about cemeteries and other sacred spaces are really important. Let's see. We also think that there should be a right to return. So in the 1870s, once Black folks were allowed to vote on the Eastern Shore in Southern Maryland, white landowners who looked around and saw a 50% split of freed black folks and white folks, pushed all the black folks they could out of that land because they were afraid that they would lose control of county government and all of that thing and all those type of things. So we think folks who are pushed out of the state of Maryland should have the ability to come back. And then we think there should be, sort of a reckoning with Maryland's past. Oftentimes, you'll hear the Democrats and other folks say an apology would be good or something like that, right? Like, I think an apology is fine. It can't be by itself, but it has to be detailed and it has to be on the historical record. So that was a lot. Let me stop there and see what we have to say.
One, thank you. Two, I feel like, and Jared, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like Andy just gave the best reason one of the best reasons for why this whole like trying to track through direct lineage of chattel slavery might not work. Because you had a whole lot that was going on after technical freedom that was still definitely enslavement that is probably not being considered by those folks. Just saying for the record. So
yeah, and then also, like, how do you determine that you? I mean, I think it would also be additionally difficult to determine not only that one was enslaved going back a certain distance, certain time period, but in what state even. And if Maryland had its biggest business of breeding enslaved people for sale to the deeper South, how the hell is everybody supposed to have a record of all of this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two entries to this. Like, some of this stuff is well kept in records, right? So, like, I think there are good Maryland historical records that talk about, that list some of the folks who were enslaved in the state of Maryland. So some of it is not hard to trace. Some of it is there. There are archival records. Similarly with redlining, right? Like, it's not actually that hard to trace the homes that were in the communities that had the red lines drawn around them. It's not infinite because it's not infinite. And I oftentimes think that, like, when we have these conversations, we think that the harm is infinite. But it is like it was a map and there was, lines drawn around it. Right. And so when we say that, like, folks who are victims of redlining should also be one of the classes of people who are eligible for reparative pay, it's because we can determine who those households were, and we can determine who is a descendant of somebody in 1870 when schools were segregated on the Eastern Shore and there were no schools for Black people. We can determine some of that, and so I think in the cases where we can determine it, and where, like, an actuarial process can be done, we should do that actuarial process and we should figure out what the amount is. Now, I also think that there's some cases where we can't determine it very well right now, but we could if we put more resources into giving the people who are good at determining those things the ability to do so. And third, yeah, there's some that we can't determine, and I think we have to accept that. But I don't think we should use the fact that there's some we can't determine in order to not determine the ones that we can, where the state had a direct role in it, or where the state had a secondary role in it, where, like, the county worked with the developer and the developer got to chase people off the land while the county looked the other way or something like that, right? Like, so I think some of this stuff is determinable. They kept records. And we should use those records in order to make sure that folks who are impacted by the actuarial claim that their property or home or life was, devalued should be able to file that claim. And we should not stop there and limit the conversation to that because, for some folks, it's not determinable. Some cases it's not. And it's not always something that was done just to a person or a family or a household. Oftentimes it was done to communities or churches or institutions and things like that. So I think we have to have a multifaceted approach to a reparative justice framework.
And I thank you for clarifying, because that I gave any impression that I was saying, like, don't bother with the other stuff was not at all my intention. I was more thinking that what you're talking about, this expansive effort to provide reparations to people who, on all different levels, in multiple ways, were impacted by a system that was intentionally created in order to prevent people from surviving.
Right.
Is I'm all on board with that. I've never at any point been of the impression that people shouldn't get cash if they have some means of like submitting whatever. I think my general problem has always been this idea that like if you don't have this one specific thing that you can prove without any doubt, then you're a parasite if you are saying that you have also been harmed by a system, right? So I just wanted to make sure, just so if somebody tries to clip and be like, "Oh, she got checked," like so that everyone understands, like that's not what I meant.
And look, I understand that the debate about this question is very rough. It's very harsh. There's a lot of folks on all sides that are saying like that the internet debate about this question is really intense. And so I understand that folks have really specific opinions about the way that this should be done, really specific opinions about who should do it and all of that. And like at the risk of stepping into that debate by offering this policy and offering this proposal, I'm trying to avoid much of that stuff and get real specific about what I think a reparative justice framework would look like to make up for the ways that the state of Maryland has enabled enslavement and then legalized discrimination and all sorts of other things that have impacted people's ability to garner wealth and pass it down, to have opportunity, to have life, and to have liberty. And I'm sure, like, one of the things, I'm sure that like somebody will find something I say here, and spend a bunch of time on X talking about why I'm wrong and I'm working out of a wrong framework. Some of that stuff is in good faith, and I listen to it. Some of the stuff I hear it, and I'm like, well, this is what I'm trying to do.
I appreciate that. So this is all fantastic. And it occurred to me that I probably should have asked you to do one thing before we got into the nitty gritty of like what the focus is. For people who did not grow up in the great age of Schoolhouse Rock and therefore do not know all the words to I Am a Bill, can you briefly explain this whole process of like the bill gets written and then some of the folks vote, and then even though it passes, the governor can say, "Oh no, we're not doing that thing." So can you explain that real quick?
Sure. Bill gets written. Individual delegates and senators will sponsor it. Caucuses like the Black Caucus can sponsor it, but officially it is sponsored by an individual senator or delegate. It goes to a committee in the Maryland Senate first. That committee has to hear it, have a hearing on it, and have a vote on it. If it gets out of the committee, it goes to the floor of the Maryland Senate. The Maryland Senate gets to vote on it, and if the Maryland Senate votes on it, then it gets sent to the Maryland House. In the Maryland House, it goes to a House committee that is parallel to the committee on the Senate side. That committee gets to hear it. That committee gets to vote on it. If that committee votes it out, it goes to the floor. And if the floor of the House of Delegates votes on it, then it's passed and it goes to the governor. The governor has an opportunity to do one of three things. He can sign the bill into law, take pictures with everybody, release a statement about why it's really good, all that type of thing. He can let it go into effect without his signature, which I think is what a lot of folks thought was going to happen, or he can veto it. You heard me mention at the beginning that Maryland has a veto-proof majority for Democrats in the House and the Senate. So with 3/5 during the next session of both houses, they can overturn the governor's veto and put the bill into law, even though the governor vetoed it. So I want to take a break here and say one of the most interesting things about there have been enough studies and I'm already doing the work argument is you would have expected at any of those 9 checkpoints before it got to his desk, if his office felt like they had been enough study and he was already doing the work, they would have said so. They would have gone to the House hearing, they would have gone to the Senate hearing, there would have been one Democrat on the House floor debate or the Senate floor debate that would have said it, they would have released an op-ed, they would have released a statement, but none of that happened. And that's because that's not, like, that was a permission structure that was given to him to veto this bill. That was not what he had been thinking all session or anything like that, or he would have said so. He would have said, he would have had his people testify at the House hearing, at the Senate hearing. Somebody would have said something on the floor vote, unless he either wanted to veto it and wanted to save this argument to, like, haha, I got you at the end, which seems unlikely, or this was a permission structure that got created for him by somebody who understood he could co-opt a radical argument in order to make liberal policy.
Man, that's, if you had to, I mean, I think you've already said it, but just so for clarification purposes, like, if you had to put it out there, which one actually happened, you would pick the latter, I assume, right?
I'd pick the latter, right? Like, I can't imagine that he set an elaborate trap for the legislative Black Caucus and all the leaders of his party on this, and that they're all, I just don't think that. I think he didn't know why he was going to veto it. He didn't have a good reason. He was looking for reasons, and somebody gave him a permission structure in order to issue a veto on this bill that allowed him to co-opt a radical argument and make it look like he was the true champion on this question. Because if he had it early on, he would have vetoed it day one, not waited till the end. But so I think it's the latter. I do think the Black Caucus will overturn it, and I think that they will. I think they will go ahead and pass this. But again, like, that will actually show the limits of studies, I think, because when the recommendations hit his desk in 2027, he's, I think, already shown us that he's not going to do this reparative framework. And so it is like, now he's going to prove himself right, that, like, we're going to do this study and it's not going to go anywhere, because he's not going to let it go anywhere if he's the next governor.
And was it you who told me this, or someone else that was making the point that he also has eyes on something bigger than Maryland governorship, which would limit his interest in being attached to some reparations bill in Maryland, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you have to keep going on national television to say you're not running for president, like Governor Wes Moore has had to do, it's pretty likely that you might be running for president, right? Like, I mean, that's the irony of this. His name has been mentioned a whole lot as a presidential candidate in 2028, and whether, and he's going to fundraisers in South Carolina, he's going to fundraisers in New Hampshire, he's traveling all over the country, raising funds and things like this. Right now, he's doing all sorts of TV appearances. So whether his view is to be the candidate in 2028 or not, he is certainly playing to a national stage and trying to craft an image of himself as a next generation leader of the Democratic Party. And so I think that is why he vetoed it. But he can't say that, right? He can't say, I want, this may be popular in Maryland, but it's tremendously not popular in the places where I would, try to get the Democratic primary nomination, maybe outside of South Carolina, where it could be a little bit popular. But, like, he can't say that. He can't say, look, I'm vetoing this because it's I have national aspirations and this doesn't play with them. But I think it's pretty clear that he has national aspirations. He's hitting the national fundraising circuit right now, and he's on the Sunday shows and on the View, and you don't go on the View if you're the governor of Maryland and you're just trying to figure out what's the best for those of us who live in Maryland.
I have to disagree. Whoopi and them they know everything. Actually, is she even still on the show? I don't even know who's on the show. That's the only name I know, but yeah.
I don't know, but So.
Sorry. So Leah's asking, didn't he also reason that he vetoed it because Maryland has Black politicians? Have you heard that excuse?
I mean,
Meaning what? What is
Maryland. Oh, let me address this. So it's like Maryland has a black governor, a black treasurer, a black attorney general, a black speaker of the House, and the largest legislative black caucus in the country. I think it's 64, 65, 66, something like that. It's 1/3 of the legislature. It actually kind of matches the demographic of Maryland pretty well in that sense. And so I think he sort of argues, um, yeah, I think other folks are making that argument, and that as the only black governor in the country and as the first black governor of Maryland, he understands the necessity to center black history in the state, all of that. Like, he says those words and things like that. And again, I think his approach to this is poverty reduction and affirmative action in a liberal framework that, I think he thinks has worked relatively well for the Democratic Party since the 1960s, and thinks is under attack right now. And it's worth defending, and fine. Like, if that's the position, stand on that. Don't try to co-opt this language about reparations and say that you're engaging in a reparative framework, when the reality is you're engaging in the same framework that the Democratic Party has given, for to black voters since the civil rights era.
Now that makes sense. Also, Bebe Rodriguez asks, can you have Mr. Ellis reference the Maryland book he references, Reconstruction Era 1875 Politics and Freedman Life?
Yeah, there's a couple of books here. So there's a book called The Road to Jim Crow, that is, I think, 1860 to 1920 or something like that. There's another book called Brotherhood of Liberty, I think, and that talks about politics in Baltimore, or black civil society forming in Baltimore despite white supremacist Democratic control in Annapolis, and how there was always sort of a independence from the state there. So two of those, I think, Brotherhood of Liberty and The Road to Jim Crow.
Thank you. Can you also, Jared, did you have another question? Because, don't get me going. Okay. Could you also, because I feel like someone somewhere else is going to say, well, what does that mean exactly? So when you say looking at policy from a reparative framework, can you explain that a little bit so people have some understanding of what you're actually talking about when you use that term?
Yeah. So there are classes of people who are directly affected by private business, public institutions, and public policy. In the case of redlining, for example, there is a class of people whose homes were redlined, and those people were directly damaged by government policy, by private lending, by all these different things. It's a group of people who, as a class, it is not. It was a racist policy, but it wasn't done to everybody who was a black person. It was a racist policy that was done to specific people in specific places. A reparative framework looks at those type of things and tries to make repair for the damage done there. Whereas I would say, like, a poverty management and affirmative action opportunity type of program seeks to give people who were broadly damaged as a race, or as a group of people in an economic class, benefits without specifying the people who were specifically damaged. And so I think a reparative framework requires this reckoning with what exactly happened to whom and what damage it had, whereas a poverty reduction and affirmative action framework says that stuff happened in the past, and here's what we're going to do to try to deal with the consequences.
All right, thank you very much. So I just want to make a quick. So we're gonna take a slight shift, because one of the things that I shared with you, and Josie's in the chat, so she'll be happy to hear me bring this up, is that there's also a bill currently being debated. It's actually not really being debated, and I think there's been a little bit of hesitancy to push it forward too much, but there's a bill on the legislative floor in the state of New Jersey with regard to making a full definition for anti-Semitism. and utilizing the IHRA definition for anti-Semitism with regard to how they detail what anti-Semitism is. They want to put $100,000 towards creating this like public thing to teach people about anti-Semitism. That's going to run out of the Attorney General's office, which tells me immediately like this is more about criminalization than it is anything else. And so for Public Square, I wrote an article, and I'm going to end up having to circle back and doing a part 2 because there's a group that is running a full statewide petition to try and not only get folks to not vote for anyone who's going to allow this legislation to move forward, but also to get people to run and to say very clearly when they're running that they're not going to allow this legislation to move forward. And I don't know, Jared, if you're still freezing when you try to pull stuff up. So if you are, don't stress yourself out, but I dropped the link to the article in the chat.
I'm afraid to try. That's the only
all right.
thing.
So I just, I'm curious. I know something like this was also happening. Am I remembering correctly that this also was something that came up in Maryland? Or
I mean, they tried a sort of different approach to it in Maryland, and the approach in Maryland was to limit campus protests. There was a bill that came up sponsored by Democrats in Maryland that would have limited campus protests and given universities extensive ability to do like time, place, and manner type of restrictions on speech at campuses. And I think it was 2 different ways to get at the same thing. Right. And that bill did not pass in Maryland. It didn't get going very far forward, but I think there are 2 different ways to get at the same thing. And I mean, I think that the fact that is it Democrats who are sponsoring this bill in New Jersey?
So it's both, actually. It's a bipartisan bill. So we've got Democrats and Republicans both signing on for it, state Senate and assembly legislation, both. In the state of New Jersey, in this upcoming election, the statewide election, every seat in the legislature is up. And so there are like 80 seats that are up for grab at the same time. And so one of the reasons that this petition and work is being done on the organizing side is because if they can shift enough seats towards people who will not support the bill, then the bill just won't go forward, and that'll just be the end of it. And of course, we've got all these people running for governor in New Jersey, and like 2 or 3 of them are getting money from AIPAC, so you already know they're not going to serve any purpose. And then you've got Fulop out of Jersey City, who's like back and forth between, like, depending on which day you ask him, his answer is different about whether or not he's going to support the bill. And so you have all of these, you have all of this conversation happening about, the bill and supporting the bill and how important it is that, the state define anti-Semitism. And really what I ended up talking about in the article, and I ended up falling down this rabbit hole, is the very interesting fact that the actual definition of anti-Semitism that's provided by the IHRA has nothing to do with Israel and has nothing to do with Zionism. And so if you just take the definition as it is and as it was written years ago, it really is about recognizing that there's behavior that is held against people of Jewish religion that's literally, and if you scroll down, the definition's actually there, like one of the graphics is the actual definition. So there's nothing in that definition which says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish and non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Nothing about Israel, nothing about Zionism. But what they do is, as you keep moving forward, they give examples right? And they give like, here's some ways that you can understand what anti-Semitism looks like. And that's when Zionism and Israel comes into the picture, because they include it as an example. So for the bill in New Jersey, they're very specific to be clear that they're talking about both the definition and the examples that are provided by the IHRA, which is why it becomes so problematic. Um, and so I just, as I'm listening to you talk about, how these bills work in Maryland and all these things, I thought it would be a good quasi pivot to also talk about these things and how they're utilized, for a purpose other than what the bill actually says, right? So the bill claims to be trying to set up a situation in the state of New Jersey where you can actually define anti-Semitism, create a financial means to, make sure everyone understands the definition, and then also follow up with people who are perpetrating that behavior against others. The problem is that when you utilize things that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, as in Israel and Zionism, what it actually is setting up to do is to just, give people a hard time and create another criminal grounds to come up for people who are pro-Palestinian, who support the Palestinian freedom, who are against genocide, who are against apartheid. Like, it creates this very messy situation where, the definition is not actually the definition, but it's going to be used to end freedom of speech.
Yeah, totally. And so look, I think that bills like this, or the executive orders, or the BDS bans that a lot of states have, or things like Maryland has this Maryland Israel Development Center where they have a joint venture with Israel in order to like have Israeli companies work in Maryland and send Maryland students to Israel universities and things like that. I think things like this actually show like a real problem with state government, because I can't imagine that like people protest saying free Palestine is the biggest problem New Jersey is facing right now. Students on campuses wearing a keffiyeh and saying in the genocide that Gaza live is not the biggest problem that most people in New Jersey have. But state government is so detached from the needs of voters and so appealing to special interest groups, donors, and national narratives that things like this pop up because they're useful for politicians to be able to get extra money, to get extra attention, to be able to get extra support and things like that, and not to solve a problem that faces the voters in the state in a real and significant way. Now, anti-Semitism might be a problem. And if anti-Semitism or anti-Islamic hate or whatever hate is happening right now as a result of conditions in the world, like, we should address that, but making it a bill about Israel is a means of appealing to a national audience, appealing to certain donors, and getting folks to care, getting access groups to care about a certain issue. And I think that this is a real problem with state government politics in general, because state politics are the most detached from voters and from what their actual needs are of any form of government. This guy, Stephen Rogers, writes a book called Accountability in State Governments. And what he finds is that people are more likely to know who their congressman is, who their president is, who their senator is, who their mayor is, their city council, and their governor than they are their state senator or their state delegate. He also finds that a whole bunch of state races don't have any competition in them. And because of that, state government is almost never responsive to voters. State government is instead responsive to interest groups who have access to them, to donors, and to national agendas that allow things to be galvanized. And I think this is a really good example of that, because certainly there's a national narrative about the importance. There's a national narrative bipartisan national narrative about the need to crack down on free speech that says free Palestine. But it helps those folks. It doesn't help folks in New Jersey who are trying to deal with, whatever folks in New Jersey are trying to deal with. And so I think part of that is a reason that I want to focus our attention on state government, and that I want to talk about third party politics in state government, because people can do what they can to stop the bill from passing, but that doesn't punish the people who introduced the bill. right? Like you need to be able to have a weapon, a political weapon, that people who are trying to defend the rights of Palestinians, defend free speech, defend the interests of Black folks, defend the interests of working folks can use to fashion against the two-party system in order to punish them and have there be electoral consequences when they do things like this. Otherwise, they're going to do things like this in order to appeal to those national narratives and those national dollars. So, it's a bad bill. It's designed, I think, it's part of a system of bills that happen in state assemblies that are sponsored by groups on the right, like ALEC, but also plenty of groups on the left who are doing this type of thing. And I think when we don't pay attention to state government because it's boring and it only meets 90 days a year and that type of thing, we lose sight of the way that big forces are playing with state government in order to make sure that it doesn't serve the needs of voters.
And that's why we bring Andy on. Just saying. Because these are not like, I don't know how much, because I know for a fact, like it took me writing this article to find out who my state senator was. Not even gonna lie, right? And I'm relatively like tuned in to paying attention to stuff, and so it's an interesting. It is an interesting. I like this idea like that people so easily overlook their local governments, not really understanding how detrimental that is to the process, right? And so it's funny because we also, we talk about like all politics are local, and is this really the case? Black Myths did a whole 2 shows on why this idea of like politics being local, you have to be really careful when you use that language, and understanding like that even local politics get really kind of bogged down by exactly what you just talked about, right? By these interests that are outside of the people who actually live in the community and within the state. And I just have like one more, and it's a follow-up based on what you just said, which would be like, so for folks who are watching right now, whether they're in Maryland or not, obviously if you're in Maryland, you should be paying attention to what Andy's doing and following him all over the place and making sure you show up to cheer him on and let him know that he has support. I drove down to Maryland on a really cold morning to help announce when Andy finally hit the go on running for governor. But outside of that, Andy, what do you suggest for people who are now kind of catching on to how this all works? What do you suggest they do in an effort to push this idea that like you should be paying attention to your local governments? Like you should be paying attention to what's happening locally. You should be understanding like how these other interests are really invading the policy that happens locally. So can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot. We were at an event recently that Baltimore Racial Justice was putting on, and this question came up: like, what do we do to pay more attention to state government? And in some ways, it is designed to be insulated. So, like, there's not really a short-term answer to this question, in a sense. Pay more attention, find groups who you agree with, find elected who you agree with, and pay attention to what they're saying. But that doesn't solve the structural way that state government is designed to be unaccountable. So I think like we need to engage in a multi-year project to figure out what it looks like to bring accountability to these levels of government that make really important decisions. They determine education, they determine labor, they determine taxes, they determine environmental policy, they determine whether you get to get arrested and kicked off a campus for saying Free Palestine, they determine whether we're going to have a reparative justice framework or things like that. And so like there's no snap and make it happen answer to it. Some of it though could be things like a show like this in the state of Maryland that was focused on things that are happening in state government. LBS does some of this with From the Streets to the State House podcasts that they have. We intend to do some of it with our campaign. I think people who are running in campaigns against state delegates can use those campaigns and those ballot lines in order to expose the corruption, in order to expose the reason the decisions happen and things like that. But there's not a short solution to it, because for a long time, the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, more the Republicans than the Democrats, have been paying attention to these and have poured a ton of resources into being able to keep it unaccountable and shape it how they want. So, like, I say that only to say it's not as if people are doing something wrong when they're not paying attention. We don't have the movement infrastructure to focus on what's happening at the state government level and hold people accountable right now. And we need to build it in part by building out alternative ballot lines that can be part of doing that.
I just want to reiterate something that we started with, which was that, as a motivational point of inspiration, maybe that even in a state that, as you pointed out, for good and for bad, I would argue all for bad, has been run by the Democratic Party almost exclusively for 100 and, did I do the, wait, what's the math on that? 1866?
Yeah.
To 2025. What's the, I don't even, somebody do, what's the math on that? And with, as you pointed out, Democrat majorities across the board, in veto proof Democratic majorities, with even more recently Black leadership up and down the line. And we can't even get a vote on reparations, never mind actual redistribution, never mind. So I just, and in a state, I would argue, probably, if I'm not mistaken, where, relatively speaking, the Black population materially is better off.
In a lot of ways, yeah. Like, in a place where there's a strong Black middle class, I don't know that, I don't, there's certainly places where Black folks aren't better off.
No. That's what I said. Overall and relatively speaking, I mean, again, compared to something that's horrible. But I'm just saying that my only point was that theoretically this should be the ideal spot for some sort of actual progressive Black politics to emerge. But
so part of the reason that it doesn't is because of that veto-proof majority, right? So the veto-proof majority means that the ability of the Black caucus or any particular progressive legislator or anybody like that to have the power to stop the Democrats from being able to overturn a veto, like, that's negotiating power. If right now it's like a 5-vote veto-proof majority, I think, in the Senate, and more than that in the House. The bigger that veto-proof majority is, the less the power of any Democrat is to be able to, threaten the caucus, Joe Manchin style or Kristen Sinema style or something like that they won't support them if they don't do certain things. So the veto-proof majority stops progressive politics from happening. There's some really good political science on this that say safe veto-proof majorities disconnect politicians from voters even more and have less progressive policy because there's no reason to, do something bold when you have structurally guaranteed that you can maintain the level of power that you have.
But also because these are not progressive parties. These are not parties designed with interest to do anything progressive. They only do what they are forced to do at a bare minimum.
So, right, and they will do more progressive things when they get closer to losing to the other side, right? Like, if they're going to do progressive things, if they're going to do things that extend labor protections, if they're going to do things that extend healthcare, if they're going to do things that we would consider more progressive, they're only going to do it when they're closer to losing, and they need to show that they will do those type of things. When they don't worry about losing because they've gerrymandered the districts in order to make sure that they have a veto-proof majority, then no. What power does the Black Caucus have? I mean, they can override this veto and get this study going. But again, what is the governor has already shown us what he would do if those recommendations hit his desk. He's going to say, thank you very much for your study. It was worthless. Now go away. Here's more poverty reduction and affirmative action.
Wow.
You know,
and I lied. I know. And I lied. I have one more question because it's something you mentioned to me, and I want to make sure I don't want us to end and then realize that I forgot to bring it up. So you mentioned to me that while media and everybody has been focused on this vetoing of this bill, that they failed to mention the other things that were vetoed that were probably, like, as far as material conditions and change right now in real time, were probably more impactful that those were vetoed, and that has not been part of the conversation. Do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And this may be a better sign that Wes Moore has his ideas on a national stage than anything else. So he also, on the same day, vetoed a bill that would have studied the impact of data centers in Maryland, and a bill that would have put together a commission that would have figured out how to have fossil fuel companies that have contributed the most damage to the state of Maryland pay for the damage that they have done. That bill said that it was going to generate $9 billion in revenue from the fossil fuel companies based on that. Now, we don't know whether that number is real or not, but that was the plan, was to use what they're trying to do in Vermont, use what they're trying to do in New York and some other place to make the biggest fossil fuel companies pay for what they did. He vetoed these two bills on the same day. Now, what's interesting here is that the data centers in Maryland are powered by fracking in Western Pennsylvania. So the fracking companies in Western Pennsylvania are investing money in data centers because they want to be able to increase the demand for their product so that solar, wind, other things can't catch up in time. So they're directly investing in the data center market, the fossil fuel companies are, right? Now, Wes Moore is probably not yet taking money from fossil fuel companies, but what he is doing is taking money from private equity and tech companies in Silicon Valley, where he's often making these fundraising trips, because those are the folks who are building the products that use the data centers, right? So if you think about what's happening here, is he did not want to have the fossil fuel companies have to pay for the damage they are done, because he wants to build data centers throughout Maryland as part of his vision for what our new economy looks like is a bunch of data centers. And he's doing that because where he gets his money is from private equity. He was a finance guy after all, and technology. He keeps promoting big tech. He wants us to be like the new Silicon Valley of the East. And we're not talking about these bills at all when we talk about the veto of the reparations bill. And I think these show really that he has these sort of national aspirations, and that whether or not you agree with him on reparations, whether you think cash payment is right, whatever you think about reparations, the veto of these bills, the Democrats who sponsored them didn't know he was going to veto, I think really signal the limits of the Democratic Party at this point, and having, what happens when you have a cool finance bro as your governor. Well, he's going to help the data centers take up a bunch of land, pollute mostly poor and Black communities, and help the fossil fuel companies keep growing in Western Pennsylvania. And it sounds so, like, even when I say this, it sounds like tinfoil hatty, right? In a sense, but it is not. Like, this is like the sort of reality of what happens when your governor is being touted as one of the next, as the next potential president. He does stuff like this because the economic interests for him and being able to do that are just too significant to allow the state to study the impact the data centers have, or study what it would take to get recompense back from the fossil fuel companies who have intentionally hurt the state.
I love when I ask a question and it sets Jared to, like, with the eyebrows and the head rubbing.
I mean, that was crazy. Like, that's First of all, it's self-criticism because it just demonstrates how little I'm paying attention to my own state, because I'm not nearly up to date on any of those details. But it's the other thing is all that you said. I mean, it's not it makes perfect sense that that's what would be happening. And then again, you can't win national, or the expectation is you can't win national campaigns if you're raising state funds by taxing major businesses, essentially. That,
Right.
and then challenging the fossil fuel industry. The first thing they'll say at the first debate is, look at how he tried to look at how he look at how he brought $9 billion to his state. He charged
Right.
1%.
Right. Like,
Like
imagine,
that would be
imagine, like,
branded as a negative.
imagine this. It's 2028. He has signed all of these bills. He is on some MSNBC debate in December in South Carolina or something, and they're like, Governor Moore, your state is pursuing reparations, has sued the fossil fuel companies, and is banning big tech from expanding jobs. What do you have to say to the voters in the Democratic primary? And he's
It's
going to say,
over.
I didn't do any of that shit. I vetoed all that.
Yeah. No, but if he had signed it, it's over. It's a wrap.
Right.
That's the first and last question.
Right.
That's wild.
And,
And
and
Leah just added there are over 300 data centers with a 5-mile radius to DC. About 200 are in Loudoun, some are in Maryland and
Jeez.
growing, which
totally.
is that's a
In
lot.
Sheesh.
Virginia is the data center. Virginia is like, we're all in on making our economy based in data centers. And Maryland, Wes Moore is like, wait, we feel left out here. Let us, give a green light to these data centers as well. And he wants to be part of the discussion. I mean, right now there's a huge discussion going on in Maryland about this Piedmont reliability power line thing, and it is basically an extension cord that is running from Western Pennsylvania to the data centers in Northern Virginia in order to give them power. And it is sponsored by some, it is like greenlit by some federal, like some sort of quasi public energy thing. The people in Maryland don't have any control over it. It's going across farmland. It's doing all of that type of thing. And it is like, it's really controversial. We don't have a big say in stopping it. And like, it is an extension cord draped across our state in order to power the data center industry in Northern Virginia. And, he's had some words that are like, I don't like it. He's been okay on this. He's been pushed on it, but he can't really do much about it because the state of Maryland is in this compact with other states for energy provision, and they sort of have to surrender their energy sovereignty toward this compact, and this compact is greenlighting it because fossil fuel companies are at the core of the compact.
And it makes me think about Amber's reporting about that the center that's in Memphis. I just got pinged, and I can't remember if I dropped it in our little group chat or not, Jared. There's like 100 acres of trees being slotted to get torn down in Bessemer so they can build a data center in Alabama that's going to take up a whole lot of land. So this is there's a lot happening with this that's going to be really problematic. That because of course capitalism is just going to it'll just happen if people aren't paying attention. And the one in Bessemer specifically is problematic because it's all happening behind closed doors and undercover. No one knows what's going on, and no one's being required to answer any questions. And they're going to turn around, and there's going to be a forest turned down, like just completely torn down and replaced with something that's spitting out nothing but dangerous fuels and energy and all kinds of shit into the environment. So yay capitalism.
And I mean, again, all of this stuff is like the results that the billionaires who own both parties are paying for, right? At the national level, billionaires own both parties. National media sets the direction and the agenda, and they're paying for these outcomes. These are the outcomes that they want. These are the outcomes that they're paying for. And they're perfectly happy with the two-party system where both parties are willing to take their money in order to get these outcomes. And if we want to do something different, we've got to like we said, Maryland is Maryland is as solidly blue, as solidly safe Democratic as possible, and they're limited in power by the way that the situation is set up. And if we want to do something different, we've got to threaten to destabilize the two-party system that allows this to happen. We've got to build third-party ballot lines, and we've got to figure out how to use those ballot lines in order to force state government to be accountable to people and be able to face consequences when they do stuff like this. And I mean, that's a good way, I think, to get attention to it, right? Is to run a campaign that calls it out and clearly identifies the way that people can take action in order to enact consequences on the folks who do this stuff.
All right. Well, I think that's all I've got. I don't know, Jared, if you have any other questions.
No, that's it. I just am inspired to do some more homework and look forward to following the campaign, supporting the campaign, and obviously extending these conversations here and wherever. So, I mean, I think this is great. And I hope folks really check in and pay attention to this argument that you're making and presenting in terms of how we need to reconsider our approach to reparations and public policy and elections.
Yeah. Excellent. Can I do a little plug for something I have coming up pretty soon?
Please do. Yeah. Please do. Plug away.
Absolutely. So 2 things I want to talk about. The first one is this coming weekend, I think June 1st or so, we're going to introduce a campaign newsletter called Theory of Change. And in Theory of Change, we're going to talk about the policy, the politics, the history, and the theory that explains how we can use third-party ballot lines in order to change these things. I think a lot of times if I say billionaires run both parties, people are like, of course they do. But then the next question is, how do we have Green Party campaigns and third-party campaigns that actually change those things where the change that we're looking to bring about is in line with our shared values. So this newsletter is going to be entirely devoted to answering those type of questions and spotlighting the historical examples, spotlighting the theory, spotlighting the policy, and building on and extending conversations like this. The second thing that I want to talk about is that June 14th, the Maryland Green Party will be celebrating its 25th anniversary. We will be in Annapolis, doing our annual assembly there. And for a third party in the United States to survive 25 years is a real accomplishment. It's not something that typically happens. Most of them spring up for 4 or 5 years. Realize how incredibly difficult this work is, and either go away or have their ideas get co-opted. The Green Party has not done that. We've stuck around for 25 years, and a lot of the things that we were originally founded on, and a lot of the things that you ran on when you were thinking about running for president as a Green Jared are still problems. We've been right all along. We've been right for 25 years, and it's becoming more and more clear that the alternatives that we're offering are important, and that getting out of the two-party trap is important. So if you want to hear more about those ideas, or if you want to just come celebrate 25 years, or if you just want to learn more, come out to June 14th, 11 o'clock, Bush Library in Annapolis, 25th anniversary assembly of the Maryland Green Party. It's going to be a chance for us to look at what has happened over the last 25 years, look at what's happening now, and then envision what it looks like 25 years from now when we've won, we've brought justice, democracy, ecology, and peace on a broader level to Maryland. More people are paying attention to state government. And some of this stuff goes beyond vision and becomes action.
Right on. And please check the website for Andy's campaign. It's in the show description, as is the link to Renee's article and work, etc. And thank you. That was great.
Thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this, to just come on and talk in depth about these things. I think social media does a good job of capturing some of what's happening, but I think sometimes we need to dive into the nuance and spend an hour and 10 minutes getting into the details of it to understand what's really happening. And I thank you all so much for the opportunity to do that with you today.
I appreciate you, Andy. This was that I'm now even more proud of myself for saying we should not try to squeeze this into 30 minutes. Let's just do something outside of our normal timeline. And maybe we
who doesn't need Or Saturdays on a Monday anyway. If it is a day off.
And maybe we can plan to circle back after Westmore makes his announcement, and we can we can talk about whether or not Andy was right or not to give grace to wait to see what Westmore announced he was.
And you know what? Let's invite the governor to debate Andy on the show about this. Let's reach out to the governor's office and I'll even, if he agrees, I'll even get us a room at Morgan State. We can all gather on campus and chop it up.
And yeah, thank you. And I know he's not going to say yes, right? But like, we need to have this debate, right? Like, this is the thing I want to stress here is like, we need to have this debate about the different frameworks. And there's good arguments in defense of their framework, and there's good arguments against this framework. And the thing, again, I think that I said at the beginning that disappointed me most is he didn't just do that. If he had just said, like, I like what y'all did here, but I have a different approach to this. I want to do what the Democratic Party has been doing for the last 60 years. I'll stand on the results of that, and I'll say that that's what we need to move forward with. Great, fine, let's do that. I love a debate, right? But he didn't do that. He tried to co-opt their radical language in order to pass off his liberal policy. And we got to push him to have a debate about these issues and to get on a stage with somebody who's going to call him on this, and not just call him on this, call Larry Hogan, call whoever the Republicans are going to put on this too, because it's not like they're the champions of this. They're still questioning whether they're due or not, right. And like, we need to be able to stand against both of them and say, y'all, both parties benefit from keeping this debate stuck on whether they're due, and the people and nobody benefits until we move to the question of what to do.
Right on. And listen, not only should everybody at minimum check out Andy's website and the argument and consider signing up and supporting, and same with the Green Party and Party for Socialism and Liberation and whoever else. But if you don't give 2 Fs about settler colonialism, do like 2 Fs and go get you a t-shirt at the Black Liberation Media store linked in the show description. All right.
I think
anything else? That's it.
Good.
We good.
I'm good.
Thank you
Andy,
all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much for the time, Andy. And we'll circle back. I'll circle back to you after this whole announcement happens. We'll come back and talk about what that all means.
Excellent. Let's do it. Thank you all.
Right on. Peace, everybody, as long as you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll see you next time on Saturdays, on a Saturday, for more Saturday with Renee.